here we go then. We're here for a dialogue with Les Spencer and Tyler Hollett. This is special to me, I think very interesting to a number of us who have gotten to know Les and Tyler separately. This is the first time they'll be dialoguing together, and the intention for today is to respond to the theme and deepen the theme, and I think be in critical relation with the theme of intentional disruption. Now, we could take that a number of ways. I might share one or two thoughts about it just by way of creating some shared context together, but I do so very much open to this moving in whatever way you both are feeling most relevant. I will just say that this is a conversation taking place inside the Voicecraft Network in the context of the question which we will be exploring over a number of months to come. Why do things fall apart? Which itself is nested inside the Cultural Shamanism expedition. And so, very potent topic, as Les likes to say. In the context of intentional disruption, we could look at that from an angle of generativity. For instance, Les and I have shared many conversations in relation to psychological process and transformative process, where disrupting various patterns of brain function might be appropriate in the context of opening into more holistic functioning. Even that itself opens questions of when is the context appropriate, what kinds of relational commitments might be appropriate in order to engage in such disruption. There's a lot there. So that's, let's say, on the psychodynamic side of things. We could also explore that pattern, and I believe this one will be of particular interest today, although perhaps there will be weaving together to an important degree. Could explore that at the level, in fact, I'll offer two more levels. One at the group process in terms of, let's say, context of mutual learning, mutual help, which is a deep interest of both Les and Tyler in some different ways, experience across different generations of this effort. And so there we might be speaking about, let's say, dynamics enabling of whether one wants to talk about collective intelligence, healing contexts, connection, relating, these types of things. And that's sort of at the group level, where disruption might be not only relevant in terms of the intentionality of it, but also disruption can come about very much unintentionally and perhaps as a necessary byproduct, really, of just humans coming together. And so there's a real dynamic to relate with here. And then the final level I'll introduce is the real macro level of social process. Both Les and Tyler have an interest in this in different ways, different lived experiences of engagement. I think we each share an interested pattern recognition when it comes to the kinds of propaganda and social influence campaigns of, let's call them, large blocks of power, whether that's government, who knows, potentially business, intelligence, artificial intelligence employed by various different types of groups as we move forward into the future, no doubt whatsoever. And we could even speak about things maybe more at the level of memetics and archetypes in the social field, disrupting each other as they want. So there's a lot there. That's some of the context that we'll be exploring together. I'm in fact going to be stepping back now. I'll just leave my video on for a little bit in case there's any clarifying questions in any way. And I'll be returning later on in the dialogue, perhaps to offer some reflections, maybe to offer to bring things back to where I'm discerning a center of engagement might be for the sake of the whole. And then other members of the Voicecraft Network will be joining in the final part. But this is primarily a dialogue between Tyler and Les. It's very nice to introduce you both together. You're both unique and special people, and so it's an honor in that way. Thank you both very much for being here. And I will open this, as we often do in the Voicecraft Network, simply to the silence. So I'm not going to offer any leading questions whatsoever, and just open it to whoever would like to step in and begin the process. Thank you both.
I was interested, Tyler, in your comments that I heard on an earlier discussion, where it says, I've heard the story. What now? If I've got you right. So in picking up on what Tim said, I've certainly been involved in situations where a disruption was ethically useful. On top of that, I've been looking for the last 30 or 40 years at the ways in which the decade of change of the 60s, the decade of change has been massively interrupted by every conceivable process by interested parties. And I'll be interested on Tyler's, your information about that. And that leads me to, if there are people that are attempting on a daily basis to disrupt the sorts of good works that are going on, what sorts of things can we practically do in order to do good works? So anyway, that's my little right. Hi, Tyler.
Pleasure to meet you, Les. Mr. Spencer, what do you prefer?
Les will do fine.
Yeah, I'm happy to go wherever you'd like. I think the way that Tim began it with the framing of multiple layers is important. I think that whenever you recognize persistent patterns at multiple scales, that tells you something even deeper. So when we can talk about these things happening at different levels, in some sense, maybe a caveat, a warning, whenever we're talking about failure, when we're talking about how things fall apart, we're touching on the processing portions of us, which are dealing with fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And so it's easy to skew those things. It's easy to misinterpret them because they're kind of an ambiguous creature that lives in the subterranean, like unconscious parts of us that we frequently try to like pull on and try to understand how it might harm us in the future. It's important that you don't fall into this kind of twin trap of either too willingly dismissing the reality of something like evil, the reality of something like a force in the world which actually desires things to fall apart and is consistently pushing on that side of things. And then the other side, you don't want to see evil everywhere because there's enormous amounts of good in the world too. And if there were not the case, then this whole game would have ended a long, long time ago, right? But there's some good quality to life which allows it to maintain itself. So a principle that I kind of use to anchor myself in terms of this, not seeing patterns where they don't exist, is probably encapsulated by something like, if I can see it happening on the playground as a kid, it's safe to, if I see that also happening like at scale, maybe it's a part of human nature. Maybe it's an element of the way that things work. So if I watch two children speaking to each other and I see one is kind of hiding an implicit desire and playing around with how they might use language in an instrumental way to achieve that desire without letting the other child know, right? Like what they really want. And first learning how to deceive. And I don't know if anyone here recalls that process of learning how to deceive your fellow brothers and sisters on this planet. But the question is, in a sense, what's occurring there? And it's something like, and to relate it to the topic, it's something like the desire to maintain or achieve your own version of the world, right? You're wanting, at the very least, you're wanting to make sure that someone else sees the world in the same way that you want them to. Right? And you're hoping it's attached to this achievement of a desire. So that hidden desire is the core of the issue, right? It's the implicit desires that we all carry around, both as individuals and as groups, that act as forces, kind of invisible forces in the way that we structure our behaviors and our expectations. And so when we're asking the questions related about why things fall apart, it's important to try to, I think, to remember the kind of the iceberg phenomenon of human nature and how we relate to each other. What we portray, the surface level, is very minimal compared to the volume and the unexplored and the unexplained, the kind of the unexposed aspects of ourselves. So yeah, I have made it an aspect of my interest, or maybe it made me, in a sense, by its shining forth. I've been very curious about how certain things fall apart in the world. And that, of course, led me to researching and reading about various clandestine services that, at this point, have become a meme unto themselves. So it's quite difficult to even invoke the existence or idea of it, and probably by virtue of a planned obfuscation, in a sense. Some element of the kind of the nature of the internet world that we live in right now is going to be dictated by, well, it's just like a profound jungle of bullshit. And the only way you're going to be able to know what's going on is to have an extraordinarily exquisite bullshit detector, a discernment, right? Some exquisite capacity, or you just ignore everything. That's probably the safest bet for most people, is to build an adjacent culture that isn't succumbing to that. That if we were to skip ahead to the end, that's my ultimate suggestion to everybody. Okay, get together and build an adjacent culture. Learn from the mistakes that we've made. It's not that hard. It really isn't. The hard part is just getting over the psychological desire to not succeed, which is very strong in human beings. They really, like, we get in our own way all the time. When things fall apart, this is the other danger that I wanted to point out. It is extraordinarily easy for us to project blame outwards, right? Because a lot of the times when things are falling apart, something we did or something we're participating in. So the desire in our psyche to kind of accumulate ultimate responsibility and just hand it off to large groups of nebulous people. You can see that way very quickly leads to mental illness, in the sense that you become captured by the notion that all ills are caused by the same thing, which is very similar in an eerie way to how chiropractors think everything is caused by the same problem in the spine. Human beings have this tendency, like, to reduce everything to like this one simple explanation. It's very efficient, energy wise. Anyhow, all right. So yeah. Anything else? What now? Yeah, we should definitely get to that. Like, but I think I did kind of just throw that in there too, though. Like, the what now is I think that people should build an adjacent culture. Some people are, of course, they always have been, like little pockets, but they haven't been able to do it in the presence of being able to network and communicate with each other and hold each other accountable in a different way, right? Because usually these things spin off in their own little private lunacies. So yeah, I would say we should probably explore the psychological elements of how it is that we contribute personally to why things fall apart, how it is that we sometimes mistake our own responsibility in that aspect and project it on others. And then the double plus ultra 5-dimensional chess idea, that the idea that we avoid blaming other people because we want to be good is exploited by people who want to avoid responsibility for bad things. And the gamesmanship that occurs when good people gather together and someone comes in and exploits their goodness. Yeah, there we go. Okay. anything tickle your fancy, or?
Yes, there's a couple of things in that. I've just been in reading that PhD that I mentioned before, that failure to succeed was one of the underlying themes in lots of people that were describing that they have continuing trauma, that there is this aspect of it's, I'm not functioning well. The other is that the society's policeman is internalised, so that they start doing the policing of themselves and others as the psychological dimension. I had the opportunity back in 2000 through to 2005 to get very large amounts of funding to travel with no burden to the locals through the back areas of Southeast Asia, East Timor, West Papua, Thai-Burma border regions with the escaping Burmese soldiers, the Cambodia, Vietnam, and the war zone down in the Philippines. And surprisingly enough, I rarely ever found anyone that was traumatised by going through absolute atrocity. They would just pick themselves up on the next day and say, life is shit at times, and let's get back to doing what we do. The resilience amongst the people in the back countries was quite extraordinary. And they had the opportunity of being together at times. So there's 14 women in the same torture centre for 5 days. And each night they would cradle themselves and sob, and then they would check their breathing and balance. They would hum their song for the night and then spend 2 hours dancing and go to bed with imagining joining with their sisters and cousins and friends on the Friday night. And I met them, and like you would never believe that they'd been through that, because these were the most joyous, wonderful. And I said, what do you do now? And we fund ourselves by selling little phone cards to give us a commission, and we go out and dance with the children of the women in the countryside that have also been raped and tortured. And we say, come and join us. Your children are dancing. We've been through what you've been through. And so the children see their mothers dancing for the first time. So there are people that are able to just pick up afterwards and keep functioning. And but this is in the face with recognising evil. A lot of these people that were doing this to them were people of absolute black heart, totally numbed, that they could do absolute nasty and force people to watch nasty for social control. And it's interesting that in going to Pol Pot's killing fields, in Phnom Penh, they had meticulously documented by photograph before, and they could age a person 40 to 60 years in 2 weeks. The photograph before and the photograph after, you'll think it was the grandchild and the grandfather. That's what their methods could do in having 100% success in having them reveal everything that they knew. Now, I found that the dominant system around the world document fully and make it fully available. So if you go in there, I found places where it documents 10 to 15 billion a year given to American universities to study every conceivable aspect of society, for funding 100 to 200 research centres like the degree to which they go into documenting stuff that they can do. And when you look at the 60s, there was a movement there that was all to do with creating a new society. It was called the New Age, or the decade of change. Within about 10 to 15 years, the system had totally evaporated every skerrick of that. So instead of being engaged in practical action such as documented in the Whole Earth Catalogue and Margaret Townsend's book, The Aquarian Conspiracy, where she documents many, many universities throughout America actually teaching courses on how to be participating in the New Age. Now, you put in the search engine about the belief systems of the New Age movement, and it talks about the head of the World Health Organization as being an architect of the New Age movement. People at the highest powers have taken over the New Age movement. In the Dialectics of Liberation conference in London back in about the 70s, most of the key speakers there were paid operatives of the dominant system. One who wrote One Dimensional Man, Marcuse, is the greatest way to want to kill yourself. You haven't got a fucking chance. One Dimensional Man, you haven't got a chance. And that's what he was telling everyone. He was the most oppressive person you could possibly imagine. And instead of the energy of going out and making new worlds, they wanted people to be in the Vietnam protest movements. They're sitting on their bums with flowers going, all we want is peace. And they're not building new worlds while they're doing that. The same thing happened in Australia. They had about 150,000 people fill the main street. And I heard the noise and I went round the corner, 150,000 people. All we want is peace. None of them are going out and making a new world. So there was absolute marvellous success, I want to think it in those terms, of the process of not only setting up the processes whereby this would done by all the new types of rhythms with Janis Joplin and the Beatles, all the music, all the drugs, get them addicted to the drugs and then criminalise it. There was 1,001 ways in which they set up the music, the belief systems. The festivals started as conference festivals. And then they eliminated conferencing out of it. And now in the major alternative festival in Australia now has got about 18 departments that turned it into a bureaucracy. And one of them is the compliance department, where they've got 18 areas of compliance. And just to finish my little rave, 2 or 3 days ago, we had 6 people stabbed in a big shopping centre. And so the police wanted to get together. Oh, what a Freudian slip. The local people wanted to get together to have a vigil. And what happened is the media the next day had 50 police sitting in rows with all their militarised police uniforms at the vigil. And then the state premier said, the government is going to look after you. The police are all here to look after you. They turned the vigil into an opportunity to market power. And that's exactly the same thing that happened back in 2009 in all the bushfires. Every member of parliament in any state level was there in all of their emergency services. I have a background in actuarial and life assurance, and I used to teach at a tertiary level on risk and harm minimisation and risk sharing. Look up DHS lexicon, risk lexicon. It's not the Department of Human Services, it's the Department of Homeland. And they have a lexicon where they have literally reframed the meaning of everything that the actuaries had in the 60s and 70s to do with risk sharing and harm minimisation. they've weaponized every concept, and that's fed to people. So that's my little rave about how. Now, I'm not overwhelmed by that in the least. I know that that's happening, and I'm beginning to recognise it more like the overtaking of the vigil. But what it does is increases my resolve to be useful to the deep state, so that I want to reverse and reframe, and there's nothing I can do about that. Anything and everything I write is going to be possibly noted and totally reversed so that they can do harm. That means that they'll leave me alone so I can do more good work for them. And that enables me to covertly talk to people like Tyler. But if they change this, say, oh, it's that old stupid old bastard, well, we won't touch him. And Tyler looks simple enough.
I assume they're listening right now. But when you live in a police state, or what could be generalized to something like an overly deterministic, an overly predicted, an overly authoritarian state, then I guess the only real way to do anything, especially one that has the full power of the 1984 Big Brother eye in the sky, literally every one of these phones is capable of rendering not just instant access to audio, but able to reconstruct three-dimensional volumetric spaces just by analyzing the sound data. I mean, they have enormously interesting tools for spying now, but okay, I want to back it up first to Tim's initial identifying of the membrane, or the possible membrane. And I don't care, in a sense. That's true. He's right about that. I don't have a personal vested sensibility about reputation or saying something stupid. Just like foolishness, perhaps. I don't know what to call it, but I can't really cognize it in the present. I have to do it in retrospect when I say to myself, oh, wow, I probably shouldn't have said that. Oh, that's not entirely true. I can control myself, but I would say that there's a mechanical kind of clinical way that I'll wind up talking about some aspects of this, and it's probably best to be explored in that way. But the reality of, well, I think, as you noted, where trauma originates from, it seems to be something like this constant, ever-present felt sense that something big is going to be taken away, like continuously. Like it's at any moment you might lose this thing. What it could be your life, right? It could be your job. It's this anxiety of loss, of things falling apart. And there's this very strange educational process that we have to go through in order to move into a space and learn the rules of it, and how to become an upstanding member of it, right? The social spaces we exist in, the cliques in our classrooms when we move through our grades, the social circles in church, all these little things we have to learn, we move into them. And if we don't follow those rules, you get perceived as a rule breaker, in a sense, right? An outsider. And then the way that people respond to that produces further classifications, further otherings, in a sense. Right? You start to subdivide this set of relationships between how it is you might relate to other people and how they feel you might be able to contribute to those activities that they engage in or not, right? And you know this, you hear the way that friends talk about each other. Oh, let's not invite so-and-so, or let's, How do you feel about that person? There's this really interesting collective sense making that's being done where you're trying to figure out, well, what would the best possible world look like if we threw all these people together? And okay, so I know there's a few kind of loose threads I just threw out there, but I want to bring in this other slightly loose thread, but it might be important for some reason. The reason that we're experiencing this this kind of profound sense of suspicion and distrust, and why we have covert intelligence agencies that span the world. And I love the fact that so many of them brazenly use like logos of like a kraken or a sea creature with tentacles that envelop the world. It's like it's not really too much being hidden for clandestine. It's the irony of it.
Okay.
Yeah, and in fact, that's the best way to hide things in plain sight, right? Of course, it couldn't possibly be true. Yeah. So, all right. So the reason why all of this is taking place is because back in the transition from the kind of the pre-modern era, the religious era, into the modern era, there was a portal opened up, right, into and we could call it a kind of a demonic realm, right? And the gnosis of being able to traverse worlds, that is the understanding of how language creates worlds. And that the secret of that was only known by a very few people for all of human history, but it's been known for a long, long time. And people have been doing it for a long, long time, casting spells. But now it's like an everyday part of we swim in it. It got cracked open and it infiltrated enormous portions of how we built our world, the techniques, the tools utilized in the creation of worlds in the minds of other people for the purposes of establishing your own world, right? And now we're in the presence of groups of people all in the possession of those secrets, those tools, with all of the resources that they possess, and they're all battling each other with their own peculiar notions of how to maintain order in the world. It's an old formula. It's not like it's new. The Romans called it panem et circenses. You keep people fed and you keep them entertained. And then you can kind of do whatever you want on the side. So there's all of that. And then I would say that one of the reasons why people don't do anything, because doing something requires an enormous expenditure of energy in the context of faith, because it's something wholly new for most individuals. It's outside of their ability to see it, and they have to trust others who can see more clearly than themselves. And they have to do that in the context of, well, being fed, right? So the world basically takes care of all the minimum needs. Everyone's above the poverty line, hallelujah. But what is it that's above the poverty line, right? What's actually floating above that mark? The life that most people are living floating above that mark is not the life that they desire to live, if you go around and speak to them. So, yeah, okay.
Well, there's a couple of things that I responded to inside in what you were saying about people have this fear of loss, and sometimes it comes unexpectedly. I've had that in my own life. I've had major losses. I know what absolute devastation. So where we can just roll on. Well, what is it to be devastated? And I found myself checking what it felt like and where it was in my body. And even though the feeling was potentially right on the edge of overwhelming, devastation doesn't kill you. These things are when you want to vomit with what you're looking at or just recoil. Again, all of these exceptionally intense emotions don't kill. We're quite capable of surviving very, very strong emotion. And I was able to go down and see where my wife put her head on the railway line to kill herself and go down there the next day. So I waited for the first train in the morning to respect her going, because it was her choice that she didn't want to live anymore. So that was one example of absolute wipeout, devastation and loss. My response was I was familiar with exceptionally strong feeling, and I had spent from finding out about 8 o'clock in the previous morning that the person who died down at the local station was my wife, that I processed very, very profound discharge of emotion to the point that I was able to go to sleep and sleep well. I did all my processing in one cathartic. Now, a lot of people can't do that, but one of the entry points that I found people spontaneously all saying the same thing right throughout Southeast Asia, that their starting point for dealing with very, very powerful stuff is their body. And they'll stand and check for asymmetries if they got one shoulder higher than the other. And if I'm like this, I find that I can't breathe very well. So if I go down and I become centered and straight, they untwist their diaphragm and get their breathing going again. They know that if I've got muscles on the back and front of every limb tight, which is in body terms co-contraction, that'll end up with the body vibrating and you're totally exhausted continually. But if you shift to being centered and not having co-contraction, the bones become load-bearing and not the muscles, and within about 2 minutes, you return to normal. But if you're in frozen cringe because of the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, you're going to feel awful and having no energy, because Kathy Freeman, our 400-metre gold medalist, she would wreck herself in just under a minute because she's used up all her aerobic capacity. So these people up in Southeast Asia that I met, I was looking for the natural nurturers. They were all saying, we address our body in space. We get our breathing going again. We get moving together with others that are of similar mind. One woman up there said she was looking for emergent phenomena, and she noticed that at the end of heavy warfare, there was absolute silence. The whole world was silent. Then when it rained, the children would play in the puddles, and the joyous play of splashing their little feet up and down in the puddles would be the signal for the birds to start chirping. And that evening, for the first time, the birds would start flying in formation, flying, almost like as if it was mirroring the networking amongst natural nurturers. And they would all twitter as they settled in the trees. Now, the morning bird chorus the next morning was the signal to the adults to start returning to normal. By the time we got out and started working in the rice fields again, and they would the women would collect the eggs. So there was a natural phenomenon that was having a return to normality. There is models in there for what we can practically do. There are people in the world today, already the dominant system is saying to the psychologists and the political scientists in the universities, use the concept prefiguration to go searching what the buggers are doing on the margins, the Spencers and Tylers of the world. And they're using the word prefiguration is how are people living the future that they want by how they live now. And they were identifying prefiguration in the Arab Spring, in the protest movements down in South America. So there are people, that's an old notion, live now as you would want the future to be. And one of the first things that they attempted to shut down is local friendly societies. That used to be the health insurance in England, the loyal Orange Oddfellows and the Racobites, local friendly societies, and little local craft ghouls and mutual help, the origins back in the 1810, 1820 of the mutual life assurance companies. We used to have over 64 life assurance companies, mutuals, back in the 60s. Now we haven't got a single one that I'm aware of. They've all been made into limited liability companies by people that wanted to destroy the idea of mutual help. But the mutual help networking, or relational networking amongst people, facilitated by Zoom meetings, but the Zoom meetings are again pernicious in terms of really discovering each other. I used to belong to an organisation where we got together every Thursday evening. But as soon as we went to going to Zoom meetings, that went backwards, and all the bureaucrats that wanted to set up a bureaucratic division between people had a field day. Anyway, that's enough from me.
Yeah, well, it's interesting when you, for that last point, when you reduce the contact point, right, to this tenuous, just kind of virtual domain, you really find out like what internal structures people have that bring them to it, right? When they're not held to account by like an enormous structure of space that you share. And I think almost all the companies found out during COVID, right, how many of their remote workers were capable of actually doing much work at all in the wrong context, being at home. It's very hard, very, very hard. And yeah, so because of that, is maybe working backwards some more, even with our best intentions, trying to make things better, we can make things fall apart. In fact, much of what we talk about in terms of, clandestine organizations and large groups, almost all of it would be efforts that they themselves would classify as goods, right? Things that they were trying to do on behalf of the good. And, after the fact, it seems pretty obvious, but in this very strange way, that is also true of looking 2,500 years ago and reading the history of a desert people that worshiped a peculiar god and judging their morals then in the same way that I do that now. And then maybe falsely attributing again a reason for why things fall apart based on like a moral impression of goodness or badness. There's a mysteriousness in a sense to why things stay together at all. And
that's right.
And I think that how we approach that is more like the truth of, I guess, it's the actual answer to it. It's not that, I guess the image is something like running around trying to catch all the fruit falling off of a tree, before it hits the ground and bruises, versus, building a net into limbs, right? It's like there's a different way to approach the natural state in which human beings are with each other, and in a deep recognition that we're very flawed and capable of immense self-deception, and that can be exploited by others, and in fact we exploit ourselves in that way. That's what's happening, right? Like there's something inside of us which is utilizing that mechanism for a short-term gain at the expense, the cost of a longer-term sense of self, right? The next morning's self, or the next month's self, or whenever the time frame is that you've put outside of that boundary state of consideration. And I think the amount of time that you can hold and care, right? The amount that you can kind of accumulate into volume, that's like a muscle that you have to exercise in coordination with others, learning trust and learning how to utilize your skills and to accept the skills of others and their mistakes and deficiencies. And that doing that produces over time, something like it's a shared language of action and behavior and understanding, if not by virtue of word alone. I mean, people that you've spent any amount of time with, you begin to speak like each other in a sense. You pick up each other's lingo. In fact, you take pleasure in doing that, of having words that kind of only the in-group know, right? And that could be something as simple as like a pet name or an inside joke or something. So I would say that I don't at this. So after all of my, I mean, it's really, I mean, there's years and years and like encyclopedic volumes of information. I've forgotten more than I could possibly ever recall in this moment of my exploration of why things fall apart and why people in the world are trying to make things fall apart. And the only justified place that I can arrive at this point is something like if you'd like to play that game, it's fine, go and play it, right? Like it's a justifiable game. It's been around forever. But there's also another game too, which seems to exist in periods of transition. Some would call it a time between worlds, right? And this is defined by an enormous amounts of chaos and also because of that, I think, suspicion. Nothing's recognizable in a sense. What's that, Tim?
Can you name the first game? You said if you want to play that game.
Yeah, the game of, I mean, the cliche language before was game A, game B, right? But it's the game of utilizing special knowledge, right, to acquire some advantage at the expense of others, right? And as that game is played over time, it accumulates a kind of ever broadening collateral damage. So, I mean, on the one hand, so this is what I find so fascinating about this, Les. On the one hand, there is an element of the spiritual kind of subjective personal side of me that says, despite any experience I've had, I want to rise up to meet the challenge of it, right? And if I do so, there's no trauma there. trauma is only in the felt sense of not being able to rise up to meet that challenge. It's in that like deep felt sense of failure. And then the question of it is, and why do some people feel that and others don't? What's causing them to feel that? And that's I mean, that's a serious, like, that's a profoundly personal question, probably for each person. Yeah. So does that make sense, Tim? I'm sure.
I've really enjoyed all of these things that you've been saying just recently about your your living with these issues and how that actually plays in your relating with yourself and others. One of the things that I'm finding myself doing is self-care, of having a very big say on what happens inside of me. If what's happening inside of me is not pleasant, then I'll take steps to see how quickly I can change that to something without just avoiding something. But I do a lot of keeping myself as strong as I possibly can, as integrated as I possibly can, so that there is an extraordinary strength. But I find if I'm tall and totally relaxed, I've been able to go into places that are exceptionally dangerous and to have such a poise and confidence that I become scary to others. If he is so relaxed in this context, what is he capable of doing? So I'll be quite prepared to, like I have worked with established relationship with over 40 murderers inside prison environments. And I'm the most dangerous bugger there, so don't fuck with me. And but apart from that, we're going to have a marvellous time together, hopefully. And they say, oh, yeah, he's cool, he's all right. Yeah, if this is where it starts, I'm going to be in a pretty good space regardless of what's happening. So that's part of it. Yeah.
You trust yourself. That's good.
Yeah. And this idea of fear of loss, well, okay, so I lose a few more things. Okay, well, that's less for me to worry about. They're gone.
So I mean, let me, Tim, you can just take this too, and just I'll wrap it up with this kind of mental image, perhaps. The danger of this Gnostic knowledge, okay, which got unleashed, is the ability to create worlds is done in the imagination. It's the realm of the imaginal. And I would argue that if we were able to measure it in a way that we measure things psychometrically, like IQ, if anything, I'm not necessarily convinced that our IQ has increased, but I do think that the total amount of imaginal creative power in human beings has increased. And the way that our world is being built, that is the innovation that's being selected for and then utilized as a resource to construct the world that we build, it's very narrowly selecting from a small range of people to make this big thing. And that the vast majority of those individuals who have been inflated as a consequence, their mental interior space has been inflated as a consequence of drinking from the alchemical kind of philosopher's stone, is that they experience profound emptiness and lack because that imaginal is unfulfilled. And those very few who are selected are experiencing this enormous benefit, right? The chalice that they're drinking from is not bitter, it is sweet. And that as that ratio increases, right, we become closer and closer towards the tipping point where the false sacrifices have to be paid. Like every debt that wasn't truly paid comes back. And that's what they're trying to stave off essentially with a fully digitified electronic matrix-like womb that you can tuck everyone into for a perfect bread and circuses, and then they'll never be upset.
Oh,
That
I have as one of my most powerful experiences, personal experiences. I was just talking to my friend who was with me on the day. We walked up Lonsdale Street and up to a park that is very little used. It's on high ground, got Flagstaff Gardens. And walking up there during the COVID, where there was absolute protest going on about the mandates, where people had to have vaccines, there was the sound like as if it was our football grand final, AFL grand final. It was about 160,000 people in the park shouting together. And it came across about 4 city blocks of 160,000 people had got there to say no to the dominant system. And as we were walking up, I noticed that all the police seemed to have all of the energy drained out of them. And when we got to the corner, there was about 60 police, and they were the most pathetic looking postures you've ever seen in your life, because they were powerless to do anything against mass people power that were galvanised over some issue, that were mutually there together, sharing a common idea. That is the potency that is prevalent in the human heart. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you both. I only step in just because this was scheduled to run for another 15 minutes. It might be nice to invite some others in. I also remember, Les, on some of the occasions where we've had number of hours of conversation, you've slept for a very long period of time afterwards. So I'm trying to... We could, in fact, speak for many hours at once, but there's something of an energetic regulation that also feels appropriate. But if I'm out of line with that, then you let me know.
That's fine.
Yeah.
It's an hour and a quarter. It's gone very fast.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel
Shamanic
like...
time distortion.
Indeed. I will just say that on that topic, Les, of the protests against the lockdowns and the mandatory vaccinations in order to return to many different types of work and what have you, I was curious and interested. I was also not particularly impressed by some of the voices of leadership that were most coming through in the context of the digital, and it felt to me as though some of the dynamics at play were very much in the mode of reactivity for political gain rather than a sufficient responsiveness and perhaps movement into some kind of wiser order of functioning or wiser mode of address. And so that might be an interesting direction for some practical movements in further conversations. I'm curious about the kind of established contexts that are and are not welcoming for the kind of conversation we might almost appreciate. A real address, a real meeting, a real dialogue, bringing in a full scope of intensities and wanting to work with them and play with them, So I'm curious, Tyler, if there's anything that's come through in the dialogue for you that sparks an interest for a coming back together, perhaps in relation to a particular topic, perhaps in relation to this one. If there's anybody who comes to mind that you might like to invite into the dialogue, whether from inside the network, outside the network.
I think in some sense, maybe the element of being inoculated against trauma in the context of a world that's increasingly driven by suspicion. I mean, like if we're like, if you and I are creatures of the internet, and we're actually spending our time here and we're interacting and dealing with these levels of kind of these different zeitgeists, these egregores, they're when you make contact with information, you get a sense that it's come from a group, right? You know, it's come from a group. It's crafted, like, I recognize that voice. What is it? Is it more appropriate to establish a kind of generalized curricula for developing discernment so that you can navigate yourself at the very least through these what are going to become increasingly, you know, turbulent information waters? Or do you disconnect entirely? Right? Do you just do you establish the generative aspect of your culture completely adjacent to, right, the attentional needs of the, you know, this economy?
And that would
I think,
speak a little bit to your question around participation now, as whether understood through the perspective of a time between worlds or perhaps in another time.
well, and it's something more, it's something more like,
Because you've got to find the
oh,
people.
well, yeah, well, it's okay. All right. Well, okay. So I'm trying really hard. My New Year's resolution, I don't really make those, but is to be less critical, to be more encouraging of people, generally.
Chinese New
So
Year or New Year?
yeah, well,
You've been
no,
doing that once since January.
yeah, it really was. Well, I mean, no, it really was kind of a joke New Year's resolution that I was making with myself at the time. But I really don't do them. And but the point is, the point still stands. Yeah, I don't like making criticisms. In some sense, I'm a kind of a useless intellectual because I don't like to criticize broadly, and that's like the basis of it. But I can't escape it in a sense. I've been drawn to it over and over and over again because a deep part of the nature in which I wish to interact with others in the world is it's subverted, it's subjugated, it's interfered with by nature of the fact that that ecosystem is contaminated by just, well, all the seven deadly sins, you know.
What ecosystem? Academia?
Oh, um, yeah, and anything that's driving the attentional network, it's something like that. It used to be subdivided, but it's everything it's all conglomerated in this. Anything that's driving the attention network on the internet, it's all kind of homogenizing. So
Speaking
I mean, like,
authority memes.
uh, yeah, well, okay, that's an interesting authority. That was because that was something Les led with that I wanted to point out. How do we recognize, or how do we grant authority? Because it is interesting how people perceive it as an objective thing, right, that someone holds, but it's a relationship that you have, right? You grant authority when someone tells you to do something, and that submission that young man went through when he allowed his own ego to be in submission to someone else's structure. I think you're right. That is what initiates. I mean, you can talk about it from a kind of a neurological, neurochemical standpoint, the norepinephrine. You can talk about the way that it can act as a buffer or a friction on dopaminergic, goal-driven behaviors. But it is, I think, more subjectively. I think subjectively, if you can't portray it and transfer it subjectively, then people can't nourish it on their own. They can't uphold it as a habitual element of their like choice space. I don't know if that
not until they wake up to relationship. I think that's the key here.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, and that's true of themselves, right? That they're being in relation to, yeah.
Because we can receive content that's shaping our orientation in relationship without being aware of our participation in that process.
Surely.
So
yeah.
It's a working with a certain given of what's not being attended to, and in the case of intentional disruption, if we bring that theme back in, intentional disruption in the context, if we were to speak about that ethically, I would say, is that intentional disruption toward the, in service of the opening up to the kind of relational awareness that it is in fact possible to be relating with we choose language now, we like integrating, obviously there's a dual process there because there's also an exploratory aspect, but in the context of authority, then in that opening up into authorship, in that strengthening of the capacity to participate as relationship in relationship. That's the truly radical thing here. That's why I mentioned the waking up to relationship. We can think about 150,000 people in the street or something like this, and that's a kind of waking up to a certain kind of collective power. But is it yet a waking up to maybe some of the deeper aspects of relationship? Perhaps not, because that themselves, to the degree that is a kind of reactive blob and just itself a kind of mob or something like this, then it's part of something a little bit more like stochastic billiard ball rather than something wanting to be a little bit more intentional. Perhaps its disruption might intend one thing and be caught along, borne along by another kind of process. Now, we always are to some degree, right? In a very important way, but surely the most radical thing of all is just, from the perspective of any power that be, is the capacity and praxis of those under the dictates of power to return to the soil of the deeper relational context that they are in fact embedded in and influenced by, and in that sense begin to participate in a kind of vitalizing, life-giving, transformative ecology that by definition is always of a kind of source potential more creative than any dictate. So maybe this, in closing, will just be my thoughts to share in terms of where I sense things moving and how they're weaving in ultimately in the context of this expedition, this project, and the praxis that can be returned to.